Okay, good afternoon or good evening, depending on where you are. Firstly, closed captions are enabled, so please click on the CC button at the bottom of the screen if you need that facility. Welcome to the last installment of Fall 2023 of the Black, Brown and Green Voices programme. I'm Dr. Miriam Nihan-Gray, and I'm honoured to be with you today to share in a conversation with the esteemed historian, Professor Leslie M. Harris. I will run through just a few quick housekeeping matters before I hand over to my NYU and African American Irish Diaspora Network colleague, Professor Kim DaCosta, who will formally introduce Professor Harris today for us. We are recording today's event and it will be published on the Glucksman Ireland House NYU YouTube channel if you'd like to watch it back again or to share it with others. And we will share the link with you following this program via the Zoom platform. We plan to run for about an hour or so. For the first 40 minutes or so, myself and Professor Harris will chat, and then we will open up to questions and comments, so please don't be shy. Before I hand over to Kim, I'd like to thank the teams at Glucksman Ireland House and African American Irish Diaspora Network for their support in mounting this programme. And I'm always so grateful for our promotional partners, NYU's John Brademas Center, NYU's Office of Global Inclusion, the New York Public NYPL Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture. We couldn't get the word out as widely without your support. Now let me hand over to my colleague and friend, Professor Kim DaCosta, to introduce today's speaker. Kim.
Okay, thanks, Miriam. Dr. Leslie M. Harris is Professor of History and African American Studies at Northwestern University. A specialist in pre-Civil War African American history, she's co-authored or co-edited 5 books, including the award-winning In the Shadow of Slavery, African Americans in New York City, and most recently, Slavery and the University, Histories and Legacies. Harris has also participated in a number of public history projects, including the groundbreaking Slavery in New York exhibition at the New York Historical Society and the accompanying book with Ira Berlin. One public history project this audience might be more familiar with, and if you haven't, you should check it out. It's A Tale of Two Joseph Moores, part of an exhibit put on by the Tenement Museum in New York City, in which the research of Dr. Harris and others is featured. The interactive website People, Not Property with Historic Hudson Valley. I could actually really go on and on in the number of public history events and wonderful scholarship that Dr. Harris has produced. So it's really a real pleasure to get to talk to her today, someone who is really inspired a lot of what we're trying to do with this series and with the African American Irish Diaspora Network. I should say that Dr. Harris is currently completing a book called Leaving New Orleans, A Personal Urban History, which combines her memoir with her own family, and urban environmental histories to explore the multiple meanings of New Orleans from its founding through its uncertain future and climate change. So what a privilege to have Dr. Harris with us today.
Thank you so much for that introduction, and thank both of you for inviting me to be here, and thanks to everyone in all the time zones.
Thank you so much, Leslie, and thank you, Kim, for that lovely warm introduction. And you're right, you could go on, and I'm just so delighted and grateful, and I want to reiterate your gratitude towards Leslie for coming on to this program to share just some of the insights and research that she has worked on over the last number of decades. In that vein, I'd like to congratulate you, and if I may address you as Leslie during the program,
Please.
if that's okay.
Of course.
I just want to make sure, I want to congratulate you on the new edition of In the Shadow of Slavery, and I want to give the full title for people tuning in case you haven't read it yet. I highly recommend it. It's called In the Shadow of Slavery, African Americans in New York City, 1626 to 1863. It must be, I don't know whether it's thrilling or weird to see a
All of the above.
re-edition. I guess it's the 25th anniversary or the
20th.
20th, sorry, okay, 20th anniversary of the
I got
first.
5 years now.
Okay, apologies.
No, not at all. Not at
But
all.
it's wonderful to see that revisited. And I will in a moment share a link to the press if people are interested in picking up the new. I'm actually looking forward to getting the new edition of it myself. Before I ask you more specifically, Leslie, I think it's important to draw attention to your own work in terms of amplifying New York City as a site of where people were enslaved, as a site of slavery. It's not really, I think, in modern to modern minds, something that we think of readily. This can be quite arresting for us to ponder. Would you mind just setting us up a little bit by speaking about, and I know that's a very big question, but New York City in general terms and historiographically as a place where we study slavery?
Absolutely. But if I might, first, I do want to thank my publisher, the University of Chicago Press, which reached out to me and offered to republish the book in a second edition. I made a few minor edits. And I did an afterward that talked about why I wrote the book the way I did, which is the question of why I started with slavery. When I was working on my dissertation in the early to mid 90s, and also when I was working on revising the book, I would say I'm writing about the end of slavery in New York. And people would look at me and say, slavery in New York? Did it end during the Civil War? There were slaves in New York? What is that? And I finally got that question one too many times. And I said, I really have to add this early history about slavery. To do that, I relied on the work of historians. There had been historians throughout the 20th century who off and on had studied slavery in the northern states, slavery in New York City, and I relied very much on their works. But there was a way in which that knowledge hadn't really penetrated into the public mind, or even most of the people I was, of course, talking to about my dissertation or the coming book were academics, other historians. Even other historians weren't aware, at least in my circles, about the meaning of slavery in New York. And this would have been again, in the 90s. Now, during the 90s, we did have the recovery of the African burial ground. And that was part of, I would say, that was an accident, the recovery of it, because it happened when the federal government was constructing a new federal building in Lower Manhattan. But that event, combined with people who had begun to ask questions about the complicity of northern places with slavery, led to the beginning, really, of broader questions for the general public about slavery and the connections of the quote unquote free North to the slave South. So when my book came out in 2003, those kinds of questions were already well underway. We even had some investigation of universities. Yale University, I think it was in 1999, there was a report completed by graduate students about Yale's complicity with slavery. So my book came out at a moment when people began investigating Northern slavery, but I'm happy to say that it's continued. And there are a couple of things I want to say too. My book mostly focuses on the experiences in New York City of enslaved people and enslavers for the first 200 years of New York City history. But historians have replicated a lot of that kind of work for other sites, rural and urban, in the North. And so we have a better understanding of what Northern slavery looked like. And it's very different, of course, from antebellum Southern plantation slavery. So that's one thing. And it is, you're talking about fewer people, you're talking about fewer numbers of Black people, of course. It's a very different part of the economy. But the other thing that's really important to remember, and this is the work I'm doing with Historic Hudson Valley, are people who are linked economically to the South and to the Caribbean. And so we call provisioning plantations is one word that is used. And at Historic Hudson Valley, at Phillipsburg Manor, there are both enslaved people and white tenant farmers who are growing wheat. The enslaved people are making, using dairy products and making butter and flour. And that, those foodstuffs are being sent to the Caribbean, to sugar plantations who are so busy making sugar that they're not growing their own food, or who, wheat doesn't grow well in the Caribbean, I think. I don't know much about, but anyway, there are all of these very deep economic connections between the North and the South, the US South, certainly in the antebellum period and in the period when there's slavery in the North, and then of course the Caribbean. There's one really interesting book that's out recently, well, actually two books. One is by Nicole Seffold Mesquil called Bound in Bondage. It's about New York's gentry population, and she's really looking at New York, not the city, of course, but also the state and the elites in New York, and how they are not just New Yorkers. They have land in some of the southern states, some of them. They have land and holdings in the Caribbean. These are people who really see themselves as part of the British Empire, which at this time is a slavery empire, right? It's a slaving empire. That slavery is what makes it economically worth it for Britain to hold on to these colonies. And then the other book I would point us to is David Gelman's new book on the John Jay family, which I haven't had a chance to read, but it's on my list, and I'm hoping to dip into it this holiday season. And that is a book about, of course, one of our founding fathers, and how from the colonial period into the 19th century, that family went back and forth, certainly was slaveholding, then became part of the anti-slavery movement, both the first more conservative movement and then some of them the radical movement. And so he's tracing generationally how slavery and anti-slavery affected, was part of that family's history. So we're getting more and more detailed about the ways in which slavery, the enslavement of people of African descent, and in some cases, the enslavement of people of Native descent, underpinned colonization, if you will, in North America, but really in the Americas in general. So I did a first pass based on what was known at the time I was writing about slavery, but that literature has grown and there's much more to say. And I'm just proud to be part of a group of historians investigating it.
I have to say, Leslie, in the vein of what you've just described, I know I want to ask you a question later about the Slavery and the University book, but I think it's in the introduction to that you and I guess your co-editors so beautifully summarize that whole kind of put like making the reader think about why wouldn't these people be part of this, like this was the system, and kind of disaggregating it from the how we read it from a modern perspective and things like that, viewing people from the past. And it's just that I must say I found that very provocative in terms of how you set that up.
Sure. I think we have to remember that slavery is not the new kid on the block, freedom is. I say that to my undergraduates, that when we're looking at when slavery begins to end in the late 18th, early 19th century, that is new not only for the Americas, not only for enslaved people, that's true globally. Slavery has existed as long as human history. And when we look at what happens in the Americas over 400 years, really, of enslavement, if we think from Columbus's arrival all the way down to when Brazil ends slavery at the end of the 19th century, we are looking at them using a system of labor that had existed for all of human history, that was associated with war. So the Quakers often said, slavery is an act of war. It is certainly a product of war, that if you are captured, being enslaved is one of the things that could happen to you in that early period. And that some of the people who are brought to the Americas are people who had been captured in war on the continent of Africa and then brought to the Americas. And so when people begin agitating against slavery in the 18th century, they really are inaugurating a new way of thinking about how humans should relate to each other. This idea of freedom and of individual autonomy is new. And when I remember that, it helps me understand why we have so many discussions and debates, even today, about what the limits of autonomy are when we live in society together. But for the people all throughout the Americas, slavery is foundational to making the idea of the Americas as a place where wealth can be produced there's almost no other way that they can imagine how to create wealth. You know, Georgia is founded as the only colony in North America that's founded in the 18th century that says that slavery is forbidden. And for 50 years, I think it is, the settlers, the colonial folks, Europeans in Georgia say, we can't do this without slaves. And finally they win right before the Revolutionary War, and they begin importing slaves. They are the only colony who founds itself as a colony free from slavery, and they fail because people can't imagine, how can I build the kind of wealth that you're asking, you know, silk farming, and of course, rice plantations, and all of the things that have been successful or could be successful in a laboring situation. These people have no way to secure the labor, so they say, to work these colonies. Because by that point, by the 18th century, slavery has been the way to make wealth for 200, 300 years in the Americas. And as I said, certainly longer than that in terms of human history. So it really is a true revolution when people begin saying slavery is wrong, it is wrong for everyone, it is wrong in terms of human history. And it is quite a struggle, as we know, to end slavery.
So that's wonderful, Leslie, and so important to kind of set us up historically and just intellectually as we think about this. My next question is equally big, but I suppose as part of the reason I asked you to come on the program, and you've so graciously given us your time today. There are Irish threads throughout, I suppose in particular when I'm thinking about your book, In the Shadow of Slavery. Can I ask you, what are your big takeaways in terms of defining Black-Irish relations in New York City, in particular in the pre-Civil War era?
Yeah, thanks for that question. I will say first, I mostly focus on Black-Irish relations in the 19th century and after slavery ends. I will say that, and that is probably the biggest flashpoint and the most complex part of the relationship between Blacks and Irish people in New York City, is in that 19th century moment. I will say that as I'm thinking in this context, and I want to say this for your listeners, that, you know, we write our books at a particular moment and we have a framework, and then sometimes, you know, you continue to think about it afterwards. I'm going to confess this as a question. I believe that there may have been Irish indentured servants in the 18th century, and that one of the things we know about the relationships between, I'll just say broadly, white indentured servants, Black enslaved people, other laborers, is that there are moments in the 18th century when those groups are, say, working for the same employer, I'll say, employer/enslaver, or are socializing together. The 1741 slave rebellion, for example, is one in which Black people and white people of all kinds of status, indentured servants, sailors, enslaved people, free Black people, although very, very few of them by that point, are involved in this conspiracy. And they are, Black people are the largest group that are punished, but we have white people too who are punished for participating in that conspiracy. I say all that to say is that by the 19th century, when Irish people come, mostly working class, in large numbers into New York, we are talking about a people who are entering into a part of the economy and often a part of the city itself, where they are going to meet Black people. And Black and Irish people often share geographic space, broadly speaking. They may share households together. They may work similar kinds of jobs. They might not, because of the way that race relations and labor relations work, they might not work literally on the same jobs. So if there's a Black waiter and an Irish waiter, a restaurant is more likely to hire all of one kind of person. They're less likely, we think, to have like a mixed labor force of Black and Irish people. But these are people who are in similar kinds of struggle in terms of trying to survive economically. And so, as we know in many different cases, if you are in proximity, if you're having similar struggles, if you can see the similarities that you share, we have many relationships that form, friendships, political alliances, labor alliances, and intimate relationships, marriages, sharing households and things. As with any set of relationships like this, there are ups and downs. There are the positives of, I can think of the waiter strike in the 1850s. Black waiters actually have a high status in that profession, make a lot of money, and encourage white waiters who are particularly Irish to go on strike with them to secure better wages, to secure their jobs. That's a rare high point of collaboration between them. At the same time, we have tensions between Black people and white working class, perhaps Irish, on, say, the docks, where Black people are seen as strike breakers. And of course, the employers are happy to have strike breakers when Irish dock workers are on strike, and to bring in Black people who are already targeted as scapegoats for any number of things in the city. And so it's not only the relationships between these two groups of working class people, it's also, I would say, how elites manipulate those relationships at times. And so you have you always have the possibility of animosity between them, but you also have employers who are willing, and other elites who are willing to use that animosity for their own ends and to hold power. And this is a classic of US labor history, even down to the present day.
So one of the things, I think Scorsese's movie captured the imagination of people. And I find, all the time, I'm sure you do, Leslie, when you talk about what you work on and even what I work on, even though I don't primarily usually work on the 19th century, people will ask about 5 points as this great site of kind of the Black Irish experience. Based on your research, Leslie, I don't know whether Scorsese had you you had your work in his on his shelf when he was doing this.
Definitely not.
Okay.
There would have been a lot more Black people in that movie if he had my work.
Right.
Yeah, I was sadly really disappointed with that movie for a number of reasons, but one was that I really thought it did not talk to the ways in which not only me, because I'm a historian of African Americans, but the way the city saw the 5 Points as a place where Blacks and Irish really lived together. And many people, many elites saw that as a threat. And it was a lost opportunity to understand how, again, people who are in a similar economic status can sometimes overcome differences of, in that case, nationality, of race, et cetera. That neighborhood was really seen and I think experienced as one in which Black people and Irish people together were certainly suffering from poverty, from underemployment, from all kinds of things. And so you have middle-class reformers moving in, trying to help with all the positives and negatives of that, bringing schools in, trying to assist people with housing and with better food and things like that. But there also is in my reading, a very negative sense of the 5 Points as a place of criminality, people who see the cooperative and even intimate relationships between Blacks and Irish as a mark of immorality. There's a lot that Blacks and Irish share in terms of music. I mean, there's this ongoing question of whether tap dance is something that develops both with Black people and Irish people, and anyone who's seen clogging and also tap dance has that question. And then when you know that Black people and Irish people are dancing together in the bars and the dance halls of the 5 Points area, you can't help but think that even if it didn't start in the same place for a moment, they were in the same place and sharing things. So the 5 Points is a very complicated place. As you know, my colleague Tyler Enbander has written a whole book about the 5 Points. So he could, much better than I, could even go into many more of the details. But the Scorsese film really does not focus in on how those two groups of people, among others, thought about themselves in relationship. And that, unfortunately, was a real lost opportunity.
Yeah, I'm actually so interested to hear you say earlier about the Black waiters trying to organize with Irish waiters, because that was sort of a way in the Tale of Two Joseph Moores piece, looking at an Irish immigrant and Black Joseph Moore, with same name, same occupation, waiter.
Mhm.
The take home for me was that, as I remember that piece, that essentially Irish waiters were able to push out Black waiters, right?
Yes.
So I'm
Mhm.
I love how you're talking, and I think our audience needs, it's really helpful to hear about a more rounded sense of community life in the 5 Points at the time. But this idea of the collaboration, but the eventual,
Yes.
Black men, Black families lose out. I wonder if you might say a
Mhm.
little bit more about that piece, because I didn't realize that there was an attempt to really collaborate.
Sure. So that collaboration was probably a high point in terms of something organized that we could see. There are always in this time period real distinctions between the status of Black people and Irish people. And one of the most important ones in this time period is that Black people don't have the right to vote at the same level of access as, say, Irish people after they have become citizens, right? So there is a period of time, if you're an immigrant, where I think it's 5 years and then you can vote, but you vote as a white person, right? There's universal white manhood suffrage in New York, and they're, I think, the first place to enact that in what is then the United States. And that means that you don't have a property requirement. You just, have to be there and be a citizen and be registered as such. But at the same time that New York institutes that, they keep and raise, we believe, the property requirement for Black men. So before this 1821 Constitution, Black people and white people vote on the same basis. But then when white universal manhood suffrage is instituted, Black men are left out and have to achieve a higher level of proof, basically, of their citizenship, which is, owning $200 worth in that time period of real property, real estate. So that's one of the many ways in which Irish, once they are past the grouping of being immigrants, have more access. The other thing I would say is that, there's a healthy literature on, quote, how the Irish became white. And that means, certainly in this case of suffrage, in terms of how they are viewed by employers, all of these things mean that if Irish and Black people are struggling over the same jobs, as we move closer to the Civil War, we see that the Irish assimilated into the white community, still at a lower level within that community, but they become more acceptable to many whites and to employers. So the waiting is an excellent example because Black people had kind of dominated that industry, but a sort of heightened racism means that for some restaurants, they make the claim that their clients don't want to be served by Black people anymore. Now, anybody who knows the history of Black people serving white people in this nation knows that that's a little bit, really? But in this case, that allows for, or perhaps even encourages, Irish people to take those jobs and other white people to take those jobs. And that is just one area. Similarly, on the docks, where they were never really welcomed as equals, or consistently Black people are pushed out by Irish. And in any number of skilled jobs, Black people from the time of emancipation in the early part of the century, if they had held skilled jobs as slaves, as enslaved people, they did not hold them, and they were sometimes actively pushed out of them as free people. And I describe that in my book as de-skilling. There's an active de-skilling of Black people, ironically, at the moment when they gain freedom. Because to own them is one thing, and to use their skilled labor for your own wealth. But then in the quote unquote free marketplace, they are downplayed, discriminated against, pushed out. So that is part of the division between Blacks and Irish in particular, but it's part of this larger division between Blacks and whites that's endemic in 19th century New York.
And I don't think, Leslie, it was unique to the men as well. The women, it was the same between Irish women and
Absolutely
African
similar.
American.
Yes, there's a similar process going on, a similar struggle in terms of domestic labor. Black women had occupied many of those domestic spots. There is a struggle in terms of hiring Irish women as domestics and other groups as well. But yes, that's another place. And again, it's these lower level manual labor jobs that are, underpaid anyway. And yet these two groups that are both heavily discriminated against are both struggling to hold on to their place in the economy at this very low level. It's very disheartening, really. It's really disheartening.
So I suppose, Leslie, for the purposes of your book, you kind of chronologically you end really with well, the draft riots don't really feature in your book, right?
Well, I end with them and then
Right.
the immediate aftermath of the draft riots. So the draft riots for me are kind of the final blow to Black people's experience in New York in the 19th century in a chapter that I call The Failures of the City. Between about 1840 and perhaps not coincidentally, as the Irish immigration is really ramping up in the 1850s, we see a literal decline, and 1863. The first thing is we see a literal decline in the numbers of Blacks in the city. And that this is a decline that happens in almost all US cities. And I'm still not completely clear, and this is North and South, that 1840, 1850, we see the numbers, the absolute numbers of Black people decline in urban areas. It could be that there's an increase in slave catching, and certainly the Fugitive Slave Law of 1850 makes places like New York, Boston, Philadelphia much more dangerous for Black people. They are more at risk of being kidnapped and taken south and re-enslaved if they ever were enslaved in the first place. It could be that there's something happening economically. Very recently, I heard someone say that Blacks in New York newspapers thought that the Census Bureau was actually undercounting Black people. And that was new. I had not heard that before. So that's something to think about. That was the census at this time, much like we had a discussion just recently, encouraged to undercount non-white people in order to make certain arguments about the nation. And of course, we have the Know Nothing, the nativist party at this time that is also, it's not in the federal government, but it certainly has a lot of power in terms of it's anti-immigrant, it's certainly anti-Black, it's anti-Catholic. So that's a possibility. At any rate, life in the city is difficult. And then the Civil War starts. That seems to be hopeful for many Blacks who hope that this is the beginning of the end of slavery. But the 1863 draft riots are this horrible moment in that year in which 3 to 5 days of brutal violence that begins against the very elite nature of the draft, which is that wealthy people could buy their way out of the draft. But of course, working class people, and particularly Irish people, could not. They simply could not afford to. And so they were going to be subject to being drafted for what they called the N-word war, to go south, to claim freedom for people that they didn't necessarily believe should be free. And also the fear that if, the vast majority of Black people are enslaved in the South, if they gain freedom and have the ability to come north and to other places, would they take jobs away? So a racism that is part of New York City meets a kind of fear that is also part of New York City of labor competition, and the anger at the federal government and the draft then very quickly turns to anger at Black people and institutions that serve Black people. I talk about the burning of the Colored Orphan Asylum, which was seen as a symbol of white middle-class benevolence towards Black people, and that's burned to the ground. And it does not rebuild within the then city limits. It moves north eventually to rebuild. Black people's homes, businesses, there are at least a dozen to 20 Black people who are quote unquote lynched, literally hung in the streets, or bodies are mutilated. After that, during and after the draft riots, many Black people, again, literally leave the city. I have a quote from one of them who says, "We left the city of New York never to return." I mean, this is, I think it's hard to describe the feeling of Black New Yorkers, of feeling under threat. They are hiding in police stations. They are hoping to be rescued. Now, I will say I have a few examples in the 5 points of those Irish people, their neighbors, turning back the rioters. So again, that proximity, there are these moments of collaboration between Black people and working class whites, including Irish, where people are like, no, we are not having this. But overall in the city, this is a real moment. It's probably one of the darkest moments for Black people in New York. And so there's a real drop in the Black population. Literal numbers again drop in New York City as many Blacks leave the city. They go to Brooklyn, so they're leaving this is the, Manhattan to Brooklyn, but many I think go farther, maybe even go to rural areas to try to make a new and a different life.
Thanks for that, Leslie. As you know, Professor Ivor Bernstein, who's the authority on the draft try, it's opened this semester's program, and we're just so thrilled and honored that you're kind of bookending it for us in this, as you say, one of the darkest moments I hope ever in New York history in terms of racial violence, etc., etc. I do want to ask you a little bit about your public history initiatives, but just kind of keeping in the tone of, well, or maybe not, of what we've just been discussing. We're very much interested in New York City in today's program and obviously in your book, but you have studied African American history in other American cities and in cities where, I've noticed that there haven't been insignificant Irish footprints like New Orleans and Savannah. Do you see the themes defining Black-Irish relations in New York City replicated elsewhere, or are there regional influences at play? Or I'm guessing it's probably a bit of both, but if you could speak a little bit to your research in those places and any Irish threads, we'd be delighted.
Sure, it's a bit of both. I haven't focused in. I love this conversation because it's made me think I need to think a little bit more about this. But I'll say this, I know probably best about New Orleans and how in the same time period, 1840s, 1850s, as you have this first really large, there had been Irish immigrants before, but that first, potato famine inspired push to the US. One of the challenges for European immigration into the South is competition with slave labor. But some, and this is true in New Orleans, encourage the migration of Irish in. And for a long time, people have said it's because they wanted them to do the kinds of jobs that they felt slave labor was too expensive to use, right? I am a little skeptical about that, but the places where they do use slave labor, building, for example, canals, draining the swamps, trying to control New Orleans is of course very watery, even, from the beginning, and trying to control the flooding there, building levees. Now, what happens is that Irish come in and are felled in huge numbers, not just by the labor, but by yellow fever. And I've just read this fantastic book on yellow fever called Necropolis by Catherine Olivarius. I'm glad I pulled her name up. An amazing book. And she talks quite well about how New Orleans elites encourage immigrants of all kinds to come to New Orleans and tell them, if you beat yellow fever, you're going to be so wealthy. And the thing is, if you beat yellow fever, the least of it's such a horrific disease. It's incredible that they encourage anyone to move to New Orleans in that time period. But I highly recommend that book. But one of the things that happens, it's not the labor of doing the work of draining the city or building canals. It's really yellow fever, which is just this horrific, deadly disease. Now, it is true that once you have it and survive it, you gain immunity, but the death rates are incredible.
Okay.
So that is one place where we have Blacks and Irish, enslaved Blacks and immigrant Irish labor really doing very different kinds of things. I don't know a lot about, for those who survive yellow fever, where they enter into the economy in the South, and that's my lack. But there are similar patterns in other Southern cities, and it's definitely something I want to look at more. Certainly they become absorbed into the white community as they do throughout in New York and in other places. I would say that it is not to the same degree as New York. And again, I do think that both yellow fever, for those of us who decide not to risk it, and slavery really keeps people out of places like New York. And even Savannah, not so much yellow fever, but just that competition with slavery. It's not as good a place to be if you're an immigrant searching for labor. people in the South really are invested in slave labor in all kinds of ways, and that really keeps European immigration down in those places.
Um, Kim mentioned earlier, Leslie, and I think actually it's how I first had the honor of meeting you rather than just reading you in books and articles through the Tenement Museum, where you've done quite a bit of work there recently, or you know, offered your kind of insights in terms of your research on New York historically around a new tour and kind of amplifying African American history in that space. Would you mind speaking a little bit just about that project?
I'm thrilled to. I just got to to see the almost final version of that tour. Kim mentioned it's the story, we started talking about it as the story of two Joseph Moores, and it's now called Union of Hope, because it goes in the same time period about the Civil War and the hopefulness of that, but also the hopefulness, I think, of coming to New York. But there are a lot of ways that you can think of when you're on the tour what Union of Hope means, and how different groups of people come to New York with a hopefulness for a new life. So this tour grew out of, there's always been an Irish Joseph Moore, who is a waiter. And on that tour at the Tenement Museum, and he lived in those actual buildings, which was the initial basis of the museum, is uncovering the families who lived in those buildings. And so they would show his name in the directory, but just above that Joseph Moore's name was a Joseph Moore colored, who was also a waiter, but who lived on a different street. And so visitors would ask, well, what does COL''D mean? And so they began to look into this and realize that this is a Black waiter. He lives in, I think it's the 8th Ward, which is not quite the 6th Ward, but very comparable. And they've done all this incredible research to find him, his wife, his family, his background in New Jersey. So he is also a migrant, but within the US. He is, I think it's Belvedere, New Jersey. He's there, and there is a moment, we think, where a slave catcher comes to Belvedere in the 1850s and tries to enslave a man who is an upstanding member of the community, has lived there all his life, and he's being claimed as a slave. And we wonder if that pushes the Black Joseph Moore to think about New York as a place where he might be more safe. Now, this is a little bit in opposition to what I was just saying about New York feeling more dangerous, but as we know, New York for different people is also a land of opportunity. So he moves to New York, meets his wife Rachel, and they live in the 8th Ward. We've well, I did a little bit, but they've recovered where he lived, and they have created what they think is an apartment that looks like the kind of apartment he lived in. Now, fascinating thing about this Joseph Moore, he and his wife live there. They have a boarder who is an Irish woman who has a Black son. So they are this family that reveals some of the themes that I was talking about. This Joseph Moore also converts to Catholicism and is Catholic. So again, we see the ways in which these people with very similar, they're living in the same neighborhood, they're having the same economic experiences, they are in intimate relationships as boarders. This Irish woman who's living with them has a Black son. We don't know, of course, not of course, but we happen not to know yet more about her or who her partner was. But these patterns that happen because people are experiencing similar things. This Joseph Moore does stay in New York through the draft riots. And then he, in the late 1860s, I think early 1870s, moves back to New Jersey, but to Jersey City. And for a totally random series of events, his apartment in Jersey, his home in Jersey City is described in a court case. And the Tenement Museum was able to, the reporter who took the story said he had a picture of Lincoln on his wall and he had this in his apartment. So there are all these pieces that give us a sense of who he was. He took in a woman. The reason he's described in this court case and in this article is that a woman was fleeing a domestic violence situation and she came to hide in their home. And so he is one of the witnesses. And so again, that gives you a sense of who he was. The museum has also tracked down some of his descendants as well. And so it's a fascinating story. They've done a great job of bringing to life not only as much as we can find out about this Joseph Moore, but also the context within which he lived, Black newspapers, what it was like to be in New York City as a Black person when the Civil War ended, how Black people celebrated that moment of the end of slavery, but also achieving citizenship with the 14th Amendment, and then the 15th Amendment achieving the vote. All of these things are things that we can bring to bear on this history of tenements that indicate that the tenement was not simply a European experience. It was an experience of all New Yorkers at different points in time. And I don't know how much we've really associated the tenement history, a kind of Jacob Riis vision is the one I always had, which is really late 19th century, with the idea that tenements are places for all kinds of poor people. And in this instance, we get to talk about Black people who are having a similar experience in the tenements and what it looks like, their part of the history of the city. I want to mention one more thing, which is that when the Tenement Museum was first founded, a woman who worked in, we believe, one of the public libraries wrote in after hearing a radio show and gave a kind of oral history of her Black New York, that her people had been in New York from, I think, the 17th, 18th century, all the way through. And she was a descendant, multiple ancestors in New York. And she describes these people living in these tenements, her ancestors. And it turns out that one of her ancestors was actually a neighbor to this Joseph Moore. I mean, it's almost magical that this story is now coming to life. So I strongly encourage people taking time to go. It's really an incredible addition to the Tenement Museum.
And just
So-
such a wonderful way to bring that history to life. Sorry, Kim.
No, well, Miriam and I had the pleasure of seeing the exhibit a couple of weeks ago. So everything that you're talking about was just such a delight and a revelation. And it strikes me, the four guests we've had this fall have been heavy on the conflict dimension of the Black Irish experience, from the draft riots to Georgetown and slavery to busing in South Boston. But what I love about what you were just talking about is that the stories about the collaboration are in the detail.
Yeah.
And we don't seem to have time for the detail.
Right.
And so much of our public discourse, but also our scholarship. And I might diverge a little bit for a moment and ask you, as I've been listening to you talk about your work, I wonder what you see as the direction that historians might take to tell and uncover more of these stories. Like, what are the possibilities? Sometimes from a distance, it seems like, oh, there's just no records. We just don't know. But every time I hear more, there's these magical revelations that come out that seem to be hidden, but
we're in a really amazing moment, I think, in terms of historical research. And I think there are a couple of reasons. One, I want to say, though, that the daily life, right? Like, of course, the draft riots, the struggle on the docks, those are the things that, even on the evening news, that's what we talk about. We don't talk about, well, today, these two neighbors, they sat in the backyard and they had a conversation about the meaning of, the 15th Amendment and what it meant to them. Like, that's hard, harder to capture and not what we think of when we think of news or history. But I will say that I do think that there are some historians who are interested in that. We sometimes use the word quotidian, just the daily, just what you do every day. I wake up in the morning and I have a cup of coffee and my wife and I look at each other and then we go to work or we take the child to school or that kind of thing. And I do think that the Tenement Museum does capture that for all of the different families, because you see the kitchen and you think about what they did on Sundays and what they did during the week and how they used the backyard as a place to do laundry and those things. The reason I think the Joseph Moore story is so fascinating is that with digitization, honestly, which sometimes I'm a little skeptical about, you can skip over a lot of things, but when you're looking for individuals and individual stories, it can be super useful. Some of the materials, information we've gotten, like I said, is from newspapers, like finding Joseph Moore, oddly enough, involved in this court case. That's like a gift. looking at the manuscript census records to see who was living in his actual apartment, and then looking to see who's in the neighborhood. Using, I think they use, it's the fire maps, which indicate what the different buildings are around them, using other kind of property records to figure out also what happens. The street that they live on, Lawrence Street, eventually it disappears in a sort of, typical New York, we need a wider street kind of thing. But, we can track it up until then. And so using digitization has really helped us sometimes find things much more quickly. Like it would have taken forever. Like who would have figured out that he went to Jersey City, But having access to digital records has really made a difference, and then connecting the dots. I agree with you. I think that I did try to do a little bit of that. With the Colored Orphan Asylum, I felt like I could get at some of that daily life, both in that institution and also why individual women and men would bring their children there. And that's because the women took notes on the children and told their stories, and sometimes told their stories over time. And we always want to find those records when we can for African Americans. And it's sometimes harder, but I'm convinced that there's more that we can find. Court cases are a great place, even though they're sometimes through the lens of criminality, but sometimes they're just describing who people are.
Thank you for that. Folks, I want to encourage you, we'll wrap up shortly, but if anyone has any comments or questions, and Kim, if you want to come in again, please do. I just want to share Benita Law Diao. I don't know whether I'm pronouncing the last part right, Benita, and excuse me if I'm not. I'm African American, and I believe my great grandfather was Irish or Scottish. John Macklin's parents or grandparents came to Virginia in the 1600s or 1700s. John was born in Mecklenburg, Virginia in 1790. Thank you for sharing that, Benita, and welcome to the program, and please come back to more. We're always so delighted to connect with people with that kind of ancestry, and hope maybe Leslie's work will inspire you to do some more genealogical digging. That's some of the fun stuff that we've done as well, Leslie, in terms of making contact with people in these kinds of spaces and sharing tools in terms of research to be able to uncover these family histories. Kim, sorry, did you want to come in there?
I do, because I'm really fascinated with this dimension of historical research, but also I'm a social scientist, and teach about the genealogical imagination. So I'm really curious how historians are developing this mode of research that combines the memoir with as a route into making sense of bigger historical trends, which you are doing. And so I'm curious if you found any surprises in the turning the research lens on yourself.
Oh, so many.
Well, I didn't share.
Well, I'm actually convening, I should tell you, and I invite you, I'm convening a conference in May, early May, on historians tracking their own stories themselves. At NYU, there's several scholars, Martha Hodes and Ferrer, and anyway.
Kendra Field at Tufts.
Kendra Field at Tufts, she'll be at the conference, and so your colleagues as well will be at the conference. So it's a fascinating thing. I was drawn to it because of what happened during and after Katrina, and trying to think of a way of talking about New Orleans that acknowledged how terrible that event was, but that we were more than just a bunch of people stranded in New Orleans, if you will. There were so many disturbing things about the coverage of New Orleans during and after Katrina. And then again, sort of like with the New York work, suddenly I realized that I was amid a lot of historians who are asking that question, using their historical tools to ask and answer questions about their own history. And it's not just about me, like who am I, in this kind of narcissistic way. It really is because we find ourselves caught up in these very intense political moments, world events. And there's a way in centering the individual, what you were asking about daily life and centering family that can bring these world changing, world shattering in some places events into a personal narrative where we can comprehend it for ourselves, and I think we think for others as well. There are all the personal revelations that you have to go through, talking with your family about what you're going to write about, and them saying, you can't talk about that. The genealogical part, though, is fascinating because I think that there are some historians who have always relied a lot on doing genealogy. I think about some historians of Latin America have often used, for example, the Mormon records as research resources. US historians have just used the US Census, but I don't think have done all of the genealogical, we haven't before mined all of the genealogical possibilities. But doing this work for my own family has made me realize how much genealogists are reading historians, even if we're not always working their angle, and it's just given me great respect for genealogists who are really doing this work, and the persistence of digging through just multiple kinds of records. I will, of course, point to both Ancestry.com, which you have to pay for, but also Family Search, which I believe is a free open access resource. Again, digitization has made it so much easier at times for people to find out more about their families, and those databases are constantly updated. So, for example, I looked for my grandfather in one year, and then 10, maybe even 10 years later, there was a new document about him being part of the Merchant Marine that I didn't know. And he went to Panama. It's like, I didn't know he did that. So there are all of these, it's, not to get too woo-woo, but sometimes I feel like the ancestors are kind of rising up and saying, don't forget about us. I mean, it really, with the Joseph Moore story and finding that connection, it's hard not to feel that you're part of something much larger than yourself when these stories are emerging in this way.
Well,
And I think that more people will, I hope that it brings more people to history and to understanding that history is not something out there, but we're all part of it. And we all can find our way to making sense of what it means for us. I think it's important politically, not in the small p electoral politics, but just who we are in the world. So,
yeah, Kim and I had jaw drop moment. We had been to the tenement tour in the summertime, and then we went back a few weeks ago, and in between, like, some really big nuggets had been found, and we had that kind of jaw drop moment where we looked at each other going, we didn't know that in July. And it's amazing how it just fleshes out the profiles of these people. So they're not these removed historical figures, or you've probably read Richard White's memoir, Remembering a Hanagran, and him talking about how it goes to something very fundamental, Leslie, as you know, as historians, how we as historians treat our family history as opposed to how the historical actors of our other types of research as well. It really puts us into a very profound place in terms of what we're doing intellectually, right?
That's exactly one of the questions I have for historians, for all of us who are doing this kind of work. Like, how does it change then how you write other histories? Because suddenly you're the object of research. And often, for most of the time, historians are not the object of research. But when you are finding out things and you have to decide how to share it, and it's about you or about your ancestors or your parents or whatever, how do you make those decisions? And as historians, we're kind of like, well, it's in the records, I'm just gonna write it up sometimes. But it really does I think it provides an opportunity to kind of sharpen your historian's lens on things and your writing. I think it presents a really interesting writing challenge as well. So it's been challenging, but it's been really fascinating too.
Yeah, an exercise in reflexivity that's very difficult.
Yes, definitely.
I want to, I'm conscious of time, but I want to, Benita said she's going to Ireland in February to do more research. So we hope to hear more on that, Benita. Marie Rosenberg, I'm African American. My maternal grandfather's Irish family's last name was Keary. Came to Louisiana late 1700s, early 1800s. We're still trying to connect the dots since my grandfather was disowned after he married a Black woman. Oh,
Yes,
wow.
this happens. Wow.
Danielle Chapman, thank you for sharing that, Marie, and welcome. Danielle Chapman, thank you, Dr. Harris, for sharing your scholarship and time. It's a privilege to be able to finally hear you speak about your work.
Thank
Oh,
you.
she has questions here. Let's see if we can get to them. Question number one, why did you decide to become a historian? That's a great one. And two, have you read The Prince of Darkness, The Untold Story of Jeremiah Hamilton,
Yes,
Wall
yes.
Street's First Black Millionaire? What do you think about the historiography for The Prince of Darkness?
Oh.
Do you
Thank
want to
you so
answer
much.
briefly? Yeah.
So yeah, quickly, I think I always wanted to be a writer. I was the kid in the library reading all the books all the time and wondering, how do people do this? And I enjoy writing. And then history became a way that, more so than writing fiction, which I don't think I'm good at, but history became a way that I could talk about issues, but also have a little bit of imagination. And it's been very rewarding. I finally got my hands on Shane White's book, and Shane White is a mentor, colleague, all the things. I mean, he's part of my group of people who, I mean, he was one of the ones who initiated investigating slavery and emancipation in New York. His book came out in 1991, and I, immediately read it, somewhat more independent. The Prince of Darkness, he's an amazing writer, and The Prince of Darkness is about what he calls Wall Street's first Black millionaire. And it's about a man that I think he believes is Haitian and is running a criminal activity in Haiti, but then moves to New York and becomes a wealthy Wall Streeter. So, but Shane is such an amazing researcher. Talk about someone who can go into an archive and come out with so much stuff. And he is based in Australia. So he will come to New York and just photocopy whole archives of materials and then take them back and just sift through them. Anyway, I highly recommend that book. It's beautifully written. It is another completely new aspect of New York that I don't think any of us knew about. And Jeremiah Hamilton is someone who is incredibly wealthy, is not political until like a Frederick Douglass or James McCune Smith. And so he really occupies this whole other space. I think his best friend is the editor of the New York Sun, a white man. I'm thinking I think it's Benjamin Day. He also, the reason I got in touch with, really started investigating him is that he's a member of the New York Society Library. And he's probably the only Black member of that library, which is founded before the Revolutionary War by whites. And anyway, that library has its own interesting history, but he's a member and he reads all these books, but he's reading like European stuff and interior design for his next mansion. It's a fascinating book. It's a really wonderful book. And again, there's so many stories that we don't know that we actually can find. Just do we have enough people and enough patience to seek them out? Shane is an amazing scholar. I recommend his work highly to anyone interested in Black New York.
Marie just asked there, do you know, Leslie, off the top of your head, where does one find the stories of the Black orphans? I presume the Black Orphans Asylum. Have you written on that yourself?
So I have a chapter in my book, and then there are two other books. Oh, shoot. I just had one on my desk. No, I don't have it on my desk. There are two other books of people who have written about the orphan asylum. One man is named William Seraile, Seraile, and I cannot remember the name of the other author, and I apologize. So there are two books about the orphan asylum. You can get the quick story from my book, and then you can read more about it. The records are at the New York Historical Society. They're amazing. And I want to tell you also that orphan asylum is still in existence. It has followed and tracked the history of what we call Black child care or foster care. Like it was an orphanage through most of part of the 20th century. And then when we stopped doing institutional orphanages and shifted to foster care, it still is in existence in Riverdale, I think it is. And I was actually in touch during the pandemic with someone who still works there. They were celebrating an anniversary and trying to think about how to do the history of that orphanage. There is still a small part of it where children are in residence, but mostly it's done more, foster care. So it's somewhere in the back of my mind. I would love to have someone else or maybe me come back and do a complete history of how it had tracked the whole history of childcare in our country and what happens when a child is in, either loses a parent. Most of the people who brought their children were single parents, single mothers, the majority, a few single fathers. So it's not they used to call it full orphans and half orphans. And this quickly became an asylum for quote unquote half orphans. It's a fascinating story. Fascinating.
Well, you're too modest to say it, but your book is so well written, so well researched, and starting off with, if you're interested in the Colored Orphans Asylum, but just more generally, I mean, In the Shadows of Slavery is for anyone interested in the history of New York, not just, quote unquote African American history. It's a must read, and I commend University of Chicago Press in bringing out a new edition of it. Your new afterword is beautiful, so nicely written. The last paragraph of it made me cry earlier, Leslie, when I was reading it. It's so nicely that, Kim, when you read it, go to that very last paragraph. It's gorgeous. We've a few people on here. I just want to acknowledge Ellen Victor. Thank you so much. This has been fascinating. And I appreciate very much. I can't wait to read your book, Miss Harris. Alice Elliott, thank you so much for this interesting lecture dialogue. I'm from Tish UGFTV. Just want you to know that this is interesting to people all over the university. Thanks again. Thank you for that, Alice. And Danielle Chapman, thank you so much. You're an amazing writer. Absolutely a great place to end. Thank you so much, Leslie. This was a really beautiful program. Thank you for giving us your time. And I hope that in the future, when you revisit the Colored Orphans Asylum or your memoir, there's maybe an Irish part to it there that we can engage with.
There might be.
Okay. Watch this space.
Today.
Watch this space. But thank you so much for a topic that is tough going at times. This was a beautiful program and a lovely way for us to end four great speakers. And you really have closed us off so nicely, Leslie. Please, everybody, do keep an eye out on social media. We will be back in the spring with some more great speakers. And thank you for your interest in what we do at Black, Brown and Green Voices and the African American Irish Diaspora Network. Please keep in touch with us. We're really just delighted to extend our community as much as possible. Thank you so much, Leslie. Kim, thank you for the introduction and for being on the call. And we'll see you all in 2024. Thank you so much.
Thank you both so much. This is lovely. Thanks everyone who tuned in. I really appreciate it. So thoughtful. Thank you.
Thanks, Leslie. Have a lovely holiday season.
You too. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.